Introducing Research Methodology 2025, your ticket to mastering research, brought to you by the Center for Learning and Teaching at Forman Christian College University in collaboration with National Academy of Higher Education at the Higher Education Commission and the United Board. This isn't just another course. It's built around the renowned Vitae Researcher Development Framework, covering everything from deep subject knowledge to personal effectiveness, professional standards, and real-world impact. We are immensely grateful to our experts who have graciously offered their time and expertise in the spirit of knowledge equity. These experts are among the leading voices in their respective fields. And yes, it's 100% online and totally free, wherever you are in the world. Whether you're a postgraduate, early career researcher, or simply passionate about better research, this course is for you. Join us and be part of a movement for knowledge equity. Sign up now and unlock your research potential.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the next session in the series. Earlier in the session 1 of module 6, we talked about research, writing, and publishing for humanities. And now in session 2, we are going to talk about research, proposal, and writing in social sciences research. For this webinar, our expert with us is Dr. Sara Rizvi. She is an associate professor and former chairperson of sociology department at Forman Christian College University. Dr. Sara completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Oxford, and she has an MPhil from the University of Punjab, also did her BSc honors in economics from London School of Economics. And she has published over 50 research papers, authored 3 books, and led multiple research grant projects as principal investigator. Welcome, Dr. Sara Rizvi Jaffrey. Thank you so much for dedicating time for this webinar. And before I leave the space for you to present, I would request Gohar Ayub to run audience through Netiquettes, and then we'll have your session. You'll have 45 minutes for your presentation, and the last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. Over to you, Gohar.
Thank you, Dr. Mavish. So you're all requested to please rename your Zoom accounts to the name of your university first, and then your name afterwards. Furthermore, please note that we have disabled the chat for the first 30-35 minutes, and around 35 to 40 minutes into the session, we will enable the chat, and you're requested to please be sensitive and mindful while you post your questions and your comments. And the Zoom chat will be strictly used for questions related to the session only. Please note, I see a lot of emails and a lot of messages and calls that we were not able to fill our information, or we forgot to fill in our information. Please note that you must, regardless you're joining through YouTube or through Zoom, you're requested to please fill out the certificate form. Otherwise, you won't be able to get any certification. So, and for certification, please note that a minimum of the session is done is required for this for the process. Please know that all these sessions will be recorded, and these recordings will be added to the CLT YouTube channel. We see a lot of new subscribers. You're all requested. For those of you who are still not subscribed, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and you'll get the notification as well. Thank you so much. That's it from my side. Over to you, Dr. Sara.
Thank you so much, Gohar. Thank you, CLT. Thank you, Dr. Mavish. So since I've started my stopwatch, since I only have 45 minutes, I'm just gonna, my stopwatch, yes. I'm gonna just share how I'm gonna split this presentation. The first 3 the first 4 sections are gonna be part 1. Where I'll cover the common mistakes, recommendations and preparation, making the transition, and a checklist. And then part 2 of our presentation will be section-wise examples of the proposals that have actually won grants. These are my own proposals, so no copyright issues. and obviously only sharing those sections from a proposal that got a grant. So here we go, because of lack of time. The most common question, like initially when we used to conduct these sessions a few years ago, Dr. Ruxana used to send a questionnaire to participants asking them what they would like to cover. And this was one of the most common problems for everyone. Well, how do we search for funding? It's so difficult. And I agree. But it's a separate, you can say, profession altogether. You need to stay in touch with your university research offices. For example, in FCCU, that would be ORIC and CLT. They usually regularly send us, they're very kind to send us regular emails about deadlines and the most popular funding grant funding. You also need to seek options and keep your mind open from both government and the private sector. Just a small note that it is possible to get multiple grants for one proposal. And in fact, the granting bodies recommend this. Perhaps they have a whole pool of resources, but they're split it between multiple projects, which is how it is in contemporary times. And they may be able to offer you very minimum funds. At that point, they will encourage you to look for other funds. Obviously, this is a very, you have to be very careful juggling this, and it requires a lot of team efforts, which we'll come to later. Regularly visiting websites such as Twitter and LinkedIn, where posts are up, coming regularly about funding. Watch out for what other local and senior researchers have done, where they've gained grants from, especially from your specialization areas, because that's where you would be more likely to win grants from in the future. Keep asking your peers and colleagues about funding sources. Instead of we usually tend to just complain about this. Why do we have to do this? Why is it part of our promotion ranking? Why does it improve our ranking and status as a researcher? We need to get beyond this and just start asking, well, where are the funding sources? And have you heard of anything? So keep a good camaraderie, share your knowledge. It's not going to limit your opportunities, that's for sure. Definitely develop a team. This is not something that you can win alone, unless it's one of those isolated grants where they're giving funding to a single researcher, maybe to sit at home and write a book. That's very rare, and so you need a team over here. What can help is if you can delegate to team members. Maybe one team member is looking out for Pakistani grants or government grants, and another one is looking at an international scale. Draft a short versus a long version of your proposal for grants, because sometimes grant bodies will request you for a shorter proposal, and some will ask for many, many details. So be prepared to edit. And then find a non-profit or sectoral collaborators. This is another reason for winning grants when you have industrial or sectoral collaborators. For example, public universities, private university researchers joining together, a climate NGO and independent researchers joining together, youth agencies and think tanks joining together, etc. It just shows the strength of the team and that a lot of experience and multidisciplinary thoughts are coming into the process. So this is another very important area, and I felt that it's important to cover this right in the beginning. What are the common mistakes for rejection? Obviously, this presentation will be shared with you by CLT. So there's no harm in actually using this as a checklist for what can help you win the grant. So common mistakes for rejection: titles that are not written well, they don't reflect what is actually being intended to do. So what happens, I want you throughout this presentation to keep thinking from the reviewer point of view. So the funding bodies and the grant bodies have reviewers. Sometimes they're not very closely linked to the granting body. They're not permanent, they're not members of the granting body, but they have been solicited temporarily to review one cycle of the grant. Now they have their own checklists, one I'm going to share with you later on. But these are usually specialists or area experts or academicians yourself, and rather a pool. So you'll have a researcher on the panel, and then you'll have an independent industrial expert, and you'll have an area expert, and you'll have a stakeholder, and they're all part of the review process, and they're looking at things. So one of them will probably, or most of them, will jump to your objectives. And if your objectives are not aligned with your titles and there's a disconnect, that's grounds for immediate rejection. Again, your titles that are too broad, they lack focus, they're too wordy, they're sounding too academic, they're aiming to do something that probably can't be done later on, is grounds for rejection. Another one, the introduction and the literature review section is probably something the granting body will read first. I'm not saying that they might not jump to the methods, they may, or the expected outcomes and significance, they may, but they will also read the introduction and literature review section. The reason for that is because they have to write comments back to the granting agency. What was the introduction like? What was the literature review? And these are some of the common things that they find grounds for rejection again. The first two are the same as common to the titles: unsatisfactorily written, lacks clarity. But the unique ones over here are including irrelevant information or sections, long paragraphs in the introduction that have nothing to do with the study. You think it's background, but obviously the reviewer thinks it's irrelevant. So sometimes you have to, you'll see this in an upcoming slide, that writing grant proposals is really about winning the grant officers and satisfying them. Sometimes what happens in publications is that they give you that room, that this is an independent researcher, their reflections and their recommendations are important for consideration. I might not find them relevant, but they're well written, I'll accept it. But granting bodies will not accept this. Another big one is using outdated references and statistics. This is very common, using a 1997 statistic for population and just missing this altogether, quoting something from the Pakistan Economic Survey that was 5 years old, whereas you have data from the last year. So be very careful that your references are and statistics are from as recent data as possible, preferably in the last 1 or 2 years. Then again, the first two ones are common for the previous, a problem statement that's badly relevant, not relevant. But another big thing to consider is that when you are drafting your problem statement for your research project, you must consider the priority areas of the funding body. Let's say the funding body has 4 priority areas, something related to economic change, social change, climate change, and demographic changes. But you are writing about another area which you think is relevant and important, or you think can be collapsed under one of those broad headings, but they don't consider it. So this happens commonly. It's happened to me as well. I might think that the gender element related to climate change is very important, but they don't feel that way, because when you go in and read details of their priority areas, they've mentioned 3 areas under climate change. 1, rehabilitation; 2, emergency responses, and gender doesn't come under that. And so you wasted your time applying for that grant because it wasn't a listed priority area. What else? Your research objectives, again, they must be clear. They shouldn't be obscure. Same with research hypothesis, but invariably what happens is usually a research proposal that aims to collect statistical data or mixed methods data sometimes misses to report hypothesis altogether. So make sure that your hypothesis is there and that it's a clear statement of prediction and that it's backed by literature. Another very important thing is that if your hypothesis of statement of prediction is not backed by a reference literature, then they're not going to accept it either. Another big one, obviously, your methodology and your research instrument. So if you're attaching a survey that you've developed and you need to reference it, or you need to justify why it's being developed, you need to list how you will be verifying that instrument. For first-time proposal submitters, I would request you to develop a survey or use a survey that's already been used, maximum attempt language translation, and make sure that all the subsections are there. You know the big ones: sample size, research design, data collection, who your data team is going to be, predicted data analysis plans, etc., etc., and then the big one, ethics. I have a sample of this as well. So what else? Other issues. The other things that the granting body is looking out for is the strengths of the PIs and collaborators. Now, this doesn't mean that young researchers or first-time applicants should be dissuaded in any way, but just that maybe they need to write things like, we have these mentors involved with us, we are approaching IRB, we've received approval from an ethics committee, we have these people who will be mentoring, or this institution that will be mentoring and then auditing our reports, and then we have these sectoral or industrial collaborators. So they're looking for the strength. Why? Because obviously of credibility. The more strength that they see, the more believable it is that this project is going to take place, it's going to be valid, the results are going to be disseminated, etc. Definitely have a budget section. Usually granting bodies will send you their own template. If not, use one of the, I have one attached, and you can use that template as well. Definitely includes clear timelines. Please make sure that they're not annual timelines, but rather monthly or quarterly timelines and targets, clearly identifying which part of the project you will complete. And then finally, include plans for dissemination. They definitely want to know that you will be publishing your work in a research journal, but they also want you to have clear plans for maybe a seminar, conference, plans to discuss, go directly, visit stakeholders, government officers, make efforts for mobilization of policy. More preparation and preliminary work. I'm going to open both the images over here and draw your attention to these minuses at the bottom. Now, what people usually think is that it's about drafting something and then submitting it. And so you're thinking of 1 month, 2 months, but it's actually all of this minus that's very important. You need to ask yourself 1 or 2 years before, do I have a team with the relevant skills and techniques? If not, how should I find that team? Or if I have a team and it doesn't have the requisite skills, how should we develop those skills? Which online courses should we take, etc.? Some of you are already doing that right now. So should I consider additional training? Do I have local, national, international collaborators? How good are my grant writing skills? Have I progressed? Do I have any knowledge of the difference between academic versus grant writing skills? Am I ready to be a full investigator, or do I need to pitch my idea to another senior principal investigator, a co-investigator? Should I find a mentor? And so these things, and then the most important things, getting your proposal ready for IRB approval, ethics, and before that, possibly ethics review committee approval, seeking feedback from mentors and collaborators. You may know seniors who will take about 3 to 4 months reviewing your proposal and giving you very valid and important feedback. So you need to account for all of this before you're actually thinking of, oh, something has come up July 25, mid-July 25, I can quickly prepare something in 15 days. The chances of you getting rejected is very high, because that just means you haven't prepared, you don't have those collaborators, you don't have the strength. A lot of people have not reviewed your proposal before it's being submitted, etc., etc. If you pre-plan 1 year before, worst comes 6 months before, you have better chances of submitting something of quality and having a better team involved to win the proposal. So 2 columns over here, the shift from academic writing to grant writing. I'm going to concentrate on the one on the right for me. I hope that's right for everybody. Yeah. So grant writing. Now, grant writing is a shift because here your write-up has to be service oriented. You are trying to win over the sponsors. It's also future oriented. You're proposing to do something. There are many, I reviewed some for HEC, and there are many proposals that just have grammar problems. They are writing in the form of, this has been done. It hasn't been done. You're actually sending a proposal. So the write-up, grammar tense, we have those English language issues. But unfortunately, the project may be good, but it's going to get rejected simply because of grammar. So be careful about that. It's project-centered and not theme-centered. So whereas you may be trying to derive a theory in an independent project or in academic writing, in grant writing, you're trying to provide a service to the community and mobilize policy making, or develop some kind of a change, or recommend some kind of an improvement for society. So it's usually project-centered and persuasive. You're selling the leader. You're telling them how important this is, why this gap is important, why this project is important. It's always team focused and never individualistic. Brevity is appreciated. They might ask you for details later, and they want you to keep those details for the report writing or the publication in the future. So here you have to be, like I mentioned earlier also, in fact, some people prepare 3 versions of their grant proposals, a very short one, a short to medium length one, and a long and a lengthy one. But even that lengthy one is usually less than 10,000 words, or even 5,000 words. So the good news is that the granting body will probably, I mean, either they're going to open up a portal and allow you to submit section-wise with certain word limits, or they'll give you a template altogether, again, that has specific word count limitations. But at the end of the day, if they haven't given you any limitations and you submit something as long as a thesis, 25, 30 pages even, it's not going to work out. You may have a lot of relevant information that you think is relevant. Try to shift, and you feel I can't cut it out, then shift it into appendices. Shift it into appendices so that at least the core can be read repeatedly, because there again the granting body is reviewing this and maybe rereading and having discussions and panel meetings, and so it has to be easy for them. Again, a quick point, don't mess up page numbers. Before you submit it, make sure that people who are looking back and forth between from the contents and the index, etc., and for the appendices, they don't get lost, that your table numbers are correct, your page numbers should be correct, etc. Here we get a lot of help from our journals. References are wrong, the journals are going to help you fix it. They're not going to reject you based on erroneous table numbers or page numbers, but granting bodies may, because they're going to doubt your clarity, your consistency, and your quality of your work. That's what they're supposed to do, right? They're going to think if the proposal isn't good enough, then they're not going to be able to complete the project. Again, the language should be easily understood. The difference with academic writing is that you can write very complicated terms, and you expect the specialized reader from history or geography to be reading it. And if they don't understand, somebody from sociology, they will take a pause and go read up about it and come back. The grant reviewers will not do this. So you need to, if you are using technical terms like gather in maternal mortality, then define it very quickly, put a footnote, and don't assume that they'll understand everything. Because again, that assumption may actually prove to exclude you from the pool. So this is a wonderful checklist. Now this checklist is, I'm going to jump a little bit. This is a typical research proposal subheadings. We're going to be covering it. I'm going to show you little sections, samples of a proposal that I won a grant for. And what people consider is that this is their checklist. Do I have the introduction? Do I have the theoretical framework? Do I have the literature review section? Do I have a hypothesis? That's not what this is. This checklist is actually what reviewers will be using, your grant body reviewers. They're going to be, so there are 4 sections. I'm going to cover the first and the fourth, and then I'll leave the rest to you due to lack of time. The first one is the importance. They're going to ask, is this research needed? And have you justified it somewhere in your writing? You may be repeating this in the introduction, in the objectives, in the concluding, the forecasted findings, in the predicted concluding recommendations. You may be repeating this, but they should be able to gauge it. And when they're writing their recommendation of whether you should win the grant versus not, they should be easily able to fill this section in. How important are the questions or gaps in knowledge? Does the proposal realistically set out the ultimate potential benefits for human society? How important is it to do this work now? Can it be deferred for another 5 years? Now, this is a question for grant bodies that are annually releasing funds. They may consider something to be exceptional. The proposal is perfect almost. We're really interested in it, but it's not a contemporary need. Is there similar complementary research underway? So, for example, has the granting body already funded high-risk pregnancies in the last 2 years? And this is something that should be part of your literature review. So if you feel that they've specifically done high-risk pregnancies, they might cover gestational diabetes now. So you have a chance to, or an edge to get in through that gap. Please take a look at yourself at the scientific potential, which includes two subheadings: environment and people, research plans, and then the justification of resources being requested. Please don't submit budget plans or even timelines that don't make sense, because invariably your grant officer, the reviewers, are researchers themselves, experienced researchers. So they know when something cannot be done in a certain timeline, or when a certain sample cannot be accessed, etc. Ethical implications. This is possibly the most important. So that's why it's beneficial when you're sending in your proposal to have your IRB certificate submitted simultaneously. That, look, I've got ethics clearance. But at the same time, you must ask yourself, is the work ethically acceptable? Are there any other ethical issues that need to be reported or considered? And are the ethical review and research governance arrangements clear and acceptable? Probably one of the most important areas, and some granting bodies will take a look at this first because of human subject investigation. Now we're into part 2. I hope we're making good time. It's writing sections of the proposal. I felt that this presentation, as with most presentations, would be incomplete unless we talk about real examples. Now, the good news is that when you're writing a proposal, a lot of researchers feel that's a lot of work and we don't get anything in return. Obviously, we may get the grant, but we don't get anything in return for all that write-up work. It gets hidden or it gets lost. Some of it we may be able to recirculate and present in the final findings and the reports or the publications. But what about all that effort? And the good news over here is that these are known as protocol papers. Proposals get published. And by the way, if you manage your time well, you may draft a proposal, and while you're applying to granting bodies, you may submit that proposal, it'll get published, and that can also help you win grants. At the same time, it works the other way around. You hide that proposal because of copyright issues or the fear that somebody might try to replicate and do something very similar. You'll apply to granting bodies, win that proposal, and then it's much easier to get that proposal published because you can also list the the funding body as name or the reference code that they give you. That also helps in very quick, speedy publications. So this is an example on the screen of one of my protocol papers that got published in BMJ Open. It was a digital health literacy intervention, and it was a randomized control trial. Thankfully, the study completed within 2 years, and then we were managed to publish 2 papers related to that as well. This is another presentation altogether, because I know what you're thinking right now. How much difference is there between the protocol paper and the actual study when it's completed and published? And the answer to that, in short, is a world of difference. There will obviously be commonalities where you'll refer back to the protocol paper, but there's much to be reported in what actually happens. And that's real life, because real life sampling, data collection, and then the findings are completely different from what you predicted. And the protocol paper usually has more about background and literature and forecasting as opposed to the actual results. So big difference, but again, that may be a separate presentation altogether. So let's get into it. This is a typical flow of a research proposal. It's minimalistic. There could be more sections. Again, your granting body may actually give you separate headings or additional headings. So watch out for that as well. The first one, setting up a theoretical framework and justifying what areas you will be studying. So this is an example of when I won a fund for a microfinance project. I use the framework for assessing behavioral healthcare, which basically divides investigation of healthcare under 2 areas: environmental factors and healthcare delivery. And you'll notice from the image below that environment and healthcare delivery system are also split between 3 areas. So just one example, environment is split between what are the social circumstances of borrowers, what are the physical and mental health circumstances, because obviously that affects loan repayment and business sustenance, and what's the economic circumstances. So basically these 6 areas add to that access, quality, and equity of healthcare delivery systems. And I'm targeting through this theoretical framework to collect data under these 6 areas. Now, having a theoretical framework and presenting it very briefly, you may choose to, for brevity's sake, take this image and put it in the appendix. But the above 2-3 lines would be part of your proposal. And that justifies to your granting body that you're not just collecting data aimlessly, but you're coming from a theoretical framework. Okay, you need to define your problem statement. And usually your problem statement is split between this. Evidence to suggest that poor women may not always gain from small loans due to inability to emerge from poverty. What is this? This is basically a background. So your problem statement is telling you the background to why this is important. And in this context, basically the study was women borrowers of microfinance and whether they emerge from poverty. So I'm straight away telling the reader or the granting body that evidence suggests that this is not true. Women remain in debt cycles. So a little bit of it is background. The rest of it is additional. What is the problem of women in debt? I mean, are they happy? They got a loan. They should be happy. No. Evidence is telling us that they suffer from physical and mental health issues. So this is also part of my problem statement. And then they also suffer from lack of basic healthcare infrastructure and substandard public health services, simply because invariably it works together. Women who are seeking loans do not have out-of-pocket expenditure for health expenses. They don't have quality private healthcare. And so they're accessing low-quality public health services. And finally, the background is strengthened by what the original intention of the Grammian model is, which is strong social features of group borrowing, health resources, training for women, and skill development so that their business sustains, etc., and monitoring their health and their social solidarity, their family circumstances. That was the ethic of Grammian model. But obviously, microfinance became very commercialized. So now your problem statement, depending on your research project, depending on your study area, has to be very targeted, telling us what the problems are for the population group that you intend to be sampling, and telling us clearly, I mean, from this background statement, you will already be able to draft research objectives. Somebody who hasn't done this project or isn't familiar, hasn't read the articles, will already be able to draft the research questions. For example, one of the research questions will be, do the women borrowers currently being sampled suffer from any physical and mental health problems? How many loans cycles have they been part of in the past? I mean, is it that they've only taken one loan cycle and emerged from poverty, or have they been taking loans for the last 10 years and their household income hasn't increased? So you can guess already. This is an example of a good problem statement. If your problem statement is not aligning or hinting at what the research questions will be, then you have a problem. Another thing you'll notice is all these brackets. These are in-text references. Now, usually what people do, it's a common mistake. They will write a problem statement or they'll write an introduction with no references, as in it's not rooted in scholarship and what is being discussed and what problems are commonly being addressed by researchers, or not, maybe not popularly because we're addressing a gap, but at least somebody has addressed it or they have highlighted the gap or a limitation. If you don't, another reason, like I mentioned, of why proposals are rejected is because they are not referenced very well and they're not referenced with most recent data. I'm sorry that my reference dates are very old, but this is a project that I won 5 years ago. That's why it's old. The references are old. So what's next? You need to summarize what your aim is in the study. And here it is. Previous research has neglected the health of women borrowers of microfinance. And in this study, we aim to gather empirical evidence regarding physical and mental health challenges. Secondary thing is that there is need for more research about women borrowers, as their lived experiences provide a deeper level understanding of the problem. And this is hinting that at secondary level, we may be able to find something because this was a mixed methods study. From the qualitative data, maybe other things will arise, maybe something related to their children's education. This is hinting at that, and this will connect back to the research design. So another very important section, why is this research needed? So we need this research, sorry for that. That's why I don't sit in office, because there's a lot of people knocking. Based on this study, we will be able to recommend improvements in women consumer protection laws. Now, this is going a little bit broader. We're connecting back to our country, our nation. local governance, maybe the economic industry or the government legislation that is dealing with microfinance sector, the health sector, social development features, social policy development, etc. So make this, again, it should be brief, but target who you, and this should be connecting back to who you will be disseminating your research to post conclusion of the project. This again is probably a section that will win you the grant. Because if they feel that you are writing this research only to show, I don't know, and I'm sorry to say this, only to show your institution heads, you're a researcher from a university and you want to share these results with your vice chancellor or your vice rector, there's less chance of your grant being accepted. Why? Versus you saying, I want to share it with my vice rector. It's about education and the importance of AI, but I also want to share it with the education ministry, and I also want to share it with parents who are monitoring children's use, and I'm also it's going to help you win the grant. So, Mavish, I've lost count of my stopwatch. I don't know why it keeps closing because people are calling. Okay, I'm 32 minutes in. Thank you. It's back. So the research question and the hypothesis. This is a common problem, as mentioned earlier, that people write a research question, they miss the hypothesis, or they don't write the hypothesis correctly. So this is an example. The research question over here is there a relationship between the social development features of microfinance? For example, do they receive group loans or individualistic loans? That's a social development feature. And improvement in health and poverty. I.e., if a woman is the prediction being maybe a woman I'm just giving another example, the prediction being maybe women in groups have better health as opposed to women who are borrowing individually. Now, so many hypotheses can be generated from this research question, but for simplicity, one hypothesis that I've written over here, apart from the one that I just said, is women loan borrowers or microfinance are not gaining with regard to health or poverty alleviation due to the lack of social development features provided by microfinance providers. And this is now backed by scholarship. So make sure that your hypotheses, again, are backed by a literature. So that's very important. The next big one is sampling. I mean, the main thing that the granting body wants to take a look at is whether you can actually sample the population you're intending to. What's your sample size? Is there any loss ratio that you want to report? How do you intend to sample? If this is a study for Pakistan, how do you intend to sample different population groups across the provinces? Do you need to apply a population weightage, given that Punjab has many more people compared to Balochistan, etc.? So the more details over here, the better. Again, if you feel that it's compromising your length, then shift it to your appendix, but make sure it's there. So what did I do? I went with the Yamani formula, and and please be careful also to report your inclusion and exclusion criteria for your sample. So the selection criteria for me was poor, and I defined it at that time according to World Bank statistics. Poor microfinance women, I think at that time it was something like less than 3.25 US dollars per day. And taking a loan smaller than USD 100, which amounted at that time to PKR 15,000. Living in disadvantaged and rural areas, so not urban and urban slums. Currently enrolled in a microfinance loan program. And so that's my selection criteria. The population sample, usually when you use Yamane, is somewhere around 300. But what you do need is that you need the actual sample size of women borrowers. At the time that I was doing the project, it was about 2 million women. And then it will come, I think my population target became 336, and I managed to get around 442 more than that. And I did population weightage according to the provincial samples, and I managed to sample 4 provinces. So if the samples have already been sent to you in the pre-reading or the post-reading material, so this publication has also been attached. You can access it and read more details about the reporting of the sample. This is a sample of operationalization of the study and measurement tools. Another reason why grants don't get won is because you haven't attached the survey. Whether it's qualitative, whether it's quantitative, whatever your questions are going to be, please attach it as an appendix. And in fact, if it's an online portal, this has happened to me once, and they don't have an option for an appendix, and there's not enough space to paste this in, then email it to them. They'll really appreciate it. So please send in your survey, your targeted survey as an appendix. And then be very careful in reporting your data collection plan. Again, this is all about credibility and believability. So women data, what I reported was that I'll have women data collectors. There will be different city leaders, 7 city leaders and 21 research assistants. They will be trained on the research objectives, how to conduct the questionnaire, ethical issues. And then I also made a plan related to interview dates, timing, etc. And then I also reported the student assistants who would come with us for notes and audio recording. Okay, so here's the table that I finally reported telling what the actual population of the country is, what the population weightage is. For example, for Punjab, it's 53%, for KPK, it's 17.2%. And then how many people I actually intended to sample from each targeted at over 500, which was over the amount of the statistic that was recommended by Yamane. And I targeted 500 because I believe that there may be some loss. I wouldn't be able to target all of them. So therefore, I didn't just target 335, which is what I advise to everybody. Try to target at least 100 more so that you meet your expected target. And these were all the cities. So this is a nice little table with a lot of detailed information condensed together. So tables will help. And again, if you don't have opportunity to plug them in the proposal, if the granting body has certain limitations in their template, then attach them as an appendix. Okay, this was a map. It's also a good idea to send in a map telling them exactly where you'll be collecting data. Then propose data analysis plan. Please don't miss this out. Tell them which software you will use, how you will assure validity and reliability, who your senior consultants will be, what your pilot testing plan will be, your data, who will be auditing your data, will it be your institute, will it be another independent body that you've solicited? With trial interventions, it can also be clinical org, so an international body online, they can do it for you as well. Most of us have to actually register with them. Otherwise, our studies don't get published later. Reliability and factor analysis, especially when you're developing your own scales, data triangulation, please report this. This is all very important to report. And again, if you feel, I don't know about this, I don't know what this means even, then that means that don't write your proposal right now. Go back, do some more reading, take some more courses, etc. And then very important also to be realistic and report your limitations and risk mitigation strategies. Due to lack of time, I'll just talk about one. So let's say you're collecting cross-sectional data and not longitudinal data. Say it. Tell the granting body that maybe this is something in the pipeline in the future, but this is my limitation for now. Then tell them that, look, I'm going to be interviewing women borrowers in their homes or outside in their gardens on a charpai. The mother-in-law may come and sit with us, in which case she is compromised and may not answer. So that's a problem, but this is how I'm going to mitigate it. Perhaps I'm going to try and interview them when they come to drop off their loan installment at the loan office. And I'll ask the loan office to give me a private room. That way I don't have interference from children, mother-in-laws, husbands, etc. So whatever limitations that you have risk mitigation strategies for, report those as well. Again, that improves your credibility. Mavish, you put your video on. Am I running out of time? 1, 2, 3.
No, it's all right.
Oh, great,
Take-
thanks. So I have 4 slides left. Ethical issues, like I mentioned earlier, this is the most important area to report because the grant agencies themselves have to list this on this website once they've released funds. That the researchers we've released funds to have received IRB clearance. They've filled out sections related to ethical observance, etc. So I won't go through it, but you can see informed consent, the cover letters, voluntary participation, opportunity for withdrawal at any point, and anonymity and confidentiality, especially your data when you're analyzing it later. Not just when you're collecting it, but when you're analyzing it later is all very important. This is an example of a budget template. I've also attached it to your pre-post reading material. So if your granting body hasn't given you one, even if it's minimalistic, please fill something out and send it to them. This is a example of a Gantt chart or a timeline. This is quarter-wise. You can do it month-wise as well. Please just don't do it 6 monthly or annually. I hope you understand what it is. The timeline goes horizontally and vertically is the steps or points of research. Plans for dissemination. This is very powerful and very needed. This also wins grants. Definitely, what happens is that people think it's all about, especially researchers coming from the academic community, think it's all about academic journal publications, but it's not. It's also about publishing policy briefs, which are quicker to read, more user-friendly for policymakers. Publishing tools of data collection is something that remains and circulates, and granting bodies love this. If you don't have any other options, you can tell them that you'll upload it to ResearchGate and free forums. Hosting workshops and seminars with stakeholders, government, community stakeholders, participation in national conferences where you'll report certain sections of your study, and this can go on for 2 to 3 years. And then plans for using this project for future research and for internet upscaling and for international collaborations. All of this is part of dissemination reporting. So here are my references. And I'll keep this slide on so that we can, as the questions come, I've finished on time. It's 45:53.
Yeah, you did. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Over to you, Mavish.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. This was really comprehensive and very insightful. In fact, praise and appreciation for the way you have explained and taken the audience through this entire process. We do have some questions here. Firstly, the first question is, how can theoretical frameworks be effectively integrated without overwhelming the reader?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I did for this and what I do for everyone, for every proposal, is I just write a couple of lines. Sometimes you may have to use 3 theoretical frameworks, or use 1 sentence each, and then attach the image and any details in an appendix. Sometimes you might not need to, and you might just need to reference the theory and talk about the theory in 1 or 2 sentences and reference it, and the grant body will understand, because they know that when you're going to publish it later on, you'll have to write sections. So they will have that much confidence in you. But what they want to see is that you've referenced a theory rather than you've missed it out altogether. That's a common mistake. People not including a theoretical framework at all. So include it, even if it's 1 or 2 sentences. They will have enough confidence in you that you know you've actually not just made it up, but you're able to reference it and talk about it in more detail and justify it, because you will need to do it anyway in your report or your academic paper. They may separately email you. Very rare that they'll separately email you for the details related to the theoretical framework, but they may email, it's a follow-up process. Winning a grant isn't I've applied and then I get news that I've won it or not. They will have follow-up meetings with you. You should be prepared. This is where another common mistake, and I see this in Pakistani funding bodies. I recently heard about it by PIDE colleagues, that people I don't know where they prepare a proposal from, or they ask somebody else to prepare it. And then when you're in a meeting, they don't know, they can't answer questions related to it. So don't do something like that. Don't use ChatGPT and don't use other colleagues to write sections for you, because you will be grilled on this proposal. Be prepared for that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I agree with Sarah that just, a little bit brief integration of the theoretical framework that's informing your research should be mentioned, but don't indulge in the details of that theoretical framework, because sometimes the grant proposals have a specific number of words and you really don't have so much liberty to discuss the theoretical frameworks and their application. And yeah, she's right that later on when you have the follow-up meetings, that is your chance to showcase your understanding of the said theoretical framework that you intend to use. So Sarah, you did talk about communication and dissemination strategies, but with the modern technology, how are these strategies changing, and how can researchers use the modern technology in a safe and ethical way to disseminate their research output?
Yeah, thank you for this question as well. A recent one is opening a website and sharing all the details related to your project, which is pretty much free now. And it can be very interactive where people can constantly email you or write comments, and you'll get feedback as well. So people do this while the project is continuing. You'll notice AI Sarosh, I won a grant with them, but their mandatory thing was that I had to go to Sri Lanka. So I asked them, well, can some of my colleagues go? And they said no, it has to be the PI, and I couldn't leave my mother and my children. So I lost out on that. Or maybe in a couple of years, if my mother feels better, I could win it. And they had a clause that you'll have a continuous website and continuous data collection pictures. You can anonymize people, and you'll constantly, and it was not just for auditing purposes for them, but it was for the wider population. And that's really excellent. I mentioned this plans for data sharing and publication tools of data collection. Now, these plans can be just uploading on free websites like ResearchGate, or making a website yourself. Another big one is that people are developing, the apps on the smartphone, and they are sharing details related to their project, data collection pictures, data tools, audio recording trainings of the intervention facilitators, data collectors. Other people can pick it up. We did this as well. With one of our publications, we attached all the training for our lady health workers and our community health workers, so that others could use that if they wish to, free of cost. And that is something, and that was also a funded project. And I think that they really appreciated that. So there are lots of ways to do this free online, and just a point that working mothers and women, single mothers, we are having those problems that we can't travel that much. We can't, what is this, going to conferences and travel, and so we feel excluded. But because most of this has become online, dissemination and sharing of information, it's advantageous. It's advantageous for all of us, and it's inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there are some non-academic ways of communicating with the interested stakeholders, as well as disseminating some snippets of your research outcomes, such as following a hashtag trend on LinkedIn or
Social media, yeah.
social media platforms, but just a hashtag that promotes your project and provides an insight into your project. So there are many ways of doing that. Recently, I came across a project where the researcher had proposed to, follow a picture timeline for the project. So they use Instagram to tell their story of the entire research. So these are non-academic dissemination strategies. Yeah, publishing a paper and conducting or presenting your work at international conferences is one thing, but there are other things as well where you can leverage social media. So the next question is, what ethical considerations must be clearly addressed in grant proposals for social researchers?
Yeah, I mean, you need to share with them. Thanks for addressing this question, because because of the time, I didn't get time to discuss it in detail, but I'm happy to go through all these points. Sorry for the numbering being wrong. Ensuring participants and researchers are not harmed physically or emotionally. So this is grounds for rejection where you haven't shared information. Like for this proposal, I had to share that informal counseling was available for women who perhaps started talking during the qualitative questions about spousal violence or abuse by their mother-in-laws. It was expected, because when you're asking them about social challenges related to loan repayment and business continuation, it's Pakistan, it's South Asia, that these are housewives, and they're going to have some problems, and they're doing business within their homes. They're going to have some problems that they might need informal counseling for. So make sure that there is hardly any research related to social problems or mental health problems or recounting of physical injuries where people are not going to suffer. And so having that as part of your informed consent or your information letters that I will be providing free counseling services, and maybe there's a gift involved for or a health transfer fee involved for women who need the initial help or referral, that really helps. And then you may be doing research where this is not relevant at all, which is okay as well, but just look out for it. Then gaining ethical clearance from relevant bodies, like I mentioned earlier, ERB, IRC, get the certificates, attach it. Gaining informed consent and voluntary participation, so attaching the informed cover letter that you intend to show to your participants and getting their initials. Again, a deal breaker is, for example, you writing that I'll ask for their name and I'll take their pictures. And with pictures, it's tricky because people will give consent to sharing their pictures 1 year, but 2 years later they revoke that consent. So never a good idea to take consent from them for pictures. Just don't take those pictures. This is my personal opinion. Provide right to withdraw at any point for any intervention or even cross-sectional research. Let's say it's a 10-minute data collection, but even then, say that even 2 minutes into the data collection, if they want to withdraw, they're free to withdraw. And then anonymity and confidentiality. So one example is that, let's say there's only one women microfinance loan officer in Sialkot, and you mentioned that in your publication, that a woman microfinance loan officer in Sialkot said this about her loan managers and the harassment that she faces. Now, this is also part of anonymity because you revealed her identity. She was the only one. So please be very careful of this. It's not just about not having names, and that's why when you're reading research, you will notice that they'll not write city names or hospital names, but they'll write Hospital A, City 1 in Punjab, Hospital A tertiary care sector in northern Punjab. And that is being done. And you can write a little note that this is being done for to preserve anonymity and confidentiality due to fewer designations. So be careful of all of these things, please. A little point.
I think really important to give to
Yeah.
assign a number
That will
to all
all-
your respondents, to come up with a strategy
that
like that.
that is part of anonymity and confidentiality, that you start coding people, and that's another process altogether. Just a small note about the social media and why I would not, unless the granting bodies will ask you if you have a Twitter handle, if you have a LinkedIn handle, and then when they are reporting that they've given you this grant, they'll start tagging you, etc., etc. But be very careful in your plans for dissemination not to mention that you will be sharing anything on social media unless they reach out. Try to cover these first. There are reasons for this because social media is becoming very tricky, and people want and granting bodies and certain research institutions will want you to share some things but not certain things. Remember, grant winning is about service. So you're really watching out for what they want. Sometimes they don't, like governments who are giving grants don't want a lot of information shared on social media. So whereas private grant bodies are development, those who are development NGOs who are giving very small grants, they want everything to be on social media. So just watch out for that. And in your initial proposal, stick to this, I would recommend. Because if they think that you're I have colleagues who are very active on social media and they say we don't win grants because of this. I don't want to take their names. But so be careful, because at the end of the day, we want to do the project. If you're feeling passionately about the project and you can't do it without money, that's the reason why you're applying for grants. So stay away from the complications initially. Next,
All right,
any other question?
Yeah. The next question is, why is capacity building often a key component of grant proposals?
Well, it is because they want to know that you are the right team to complete this project. The biggest problem for the granting body is what? That they start releasing funds and you haven't completed the project. Or it's a 2-year project and you were right up there the first year. But the second year, so sorry, the first year was more about survey refinement and ascertaining your sample. And the second period was more about the actual data collection. But you've fallen at that second stage. And that's why capacity building is so important. And that's why some grant bodies will have 3 months of capacity. They will tell you, sorry about that. They will tell you that you won the grant, and then they will say, please don't start this. You have 3 months of capacity building training. They still consider you to be short. Actually, what they're doing at that point is training you for completion and training you for modification where they feel this may not be possible. This may not be possible. This we circumvent in this way. This is another risk that may happen, may not happen. I'm just telling the students who are messaging me from outside that I'm in a meeting.
It's all right.
Yeah.
We totally understand this. So this one, although we are running out of time, but this one's a very interesting question, and I think it should be asked. How should we differentiate between conceptual and theoretical frameworks, and how should be covered in the grant proposal?
Conceptual framework, I think what you're trying to ask is, look, the theoretical framework that you will be using is already an operationalized theory that has been used. So let's say you're using a theory of lived religion, and you're trying to deliver an interfaith harmony intervention, which is my last project. That's why it's fresh in my mind. Now, the theory is telling you through the reference literature that another study has been done, and I would recommend to use this kind of a theory. I understand your question. I think it hasn't been phrased properly. So a theory that has already been used for a study project, which you can reference, is the one to use, because that theory of religion has already the theory of lived religion has already been used in another project to show that people don't use religion based on textbook, but they interpret it and then they practice it in real life based on their environment and their circumstances. So 50 years from now, somebody who was living religion according to their society, like they were living in an agrarian community, more traditional society, more conservative. So they had no qualms in spending more time saying their prayers and telling people at their workplace, I'm going for my prayers. But people are not living religion that way because they feel the penalization and the stigmatization against them will be worse, and the economic necessities and survival and professional placement is greater in this time. So I'm using, let's say now somebody's used this already, proved it already. I have the reference and the citation. Now I start using it to see how madrasa students are living religion. Two groups, one who after madrasa attend conventional universities and one who after madrasa don't attend universities and go straight into the workplace, and the comparison between them, and to see how they are living religion. And one of my findings is that those who don't attend a conventional university are still replicating patterns of people from 50 years ago versus the other group. So please use a theory. Listen, you know what? This takes a lot of time. When people are, I want to win a grant, I want to do this proposal. The biggest missing link is literature review for studies related to that project, that study area, and literature review for theoretical framework. It may take you 1 week. I don't know. It may, some people will actually say, it took me 1 week. But it should actually take you 1 to 2 months minimum. And if you haven't spent that time and you're saying, I don't know which theory, then that means you don't know your study area. You're not a specialist. So even if your project is well written, you might not win in the post stages, which is when people are asking you in the meetings about your theoretical framework and is this the right one? Invariably, your reviewers will have another 10 theories and they'll say, well, why didn't you choose this theory? And so you have to be able to say, well, I read all 10 and I feel this one is better.
Yeah.
That's how it is.
Very good point. Actually, yeah, it's a very valid point that sometimes everything's really well done, but your work packages do not complement the kind of hard work that is required to win serious grants. So this brings us to the end of this wonderful session. Thank you so much, Sarah. We have rave reviews in the chat. Somebody, in fact, Narinder Kumar from University of Sindh has very straightforwardly said that this is the best session that I've ever attended in my life. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And all of you who are in this webinar, just a quick reminder that we will have the next 2 webinars on 2nd of July. These webinars are about reading, writing, and publishing in natural sciences, and then grants and proposals writing. Again, from a different perspective. So join us on 2nd of July as well for these 2 sessions. There are some questions which I have not deliberately posed to the resource person. They are very basic in terms of when should you apply for a research proposal grant, or what's the most suitable time after your PhD. You see, different grants have different requirements. Sometimes they do want you to have post-PhD experience. Sometimes they want, sometimes there's a specific number. For example, in Marie Curie fellowships, they do have 8 years of time limitation post-PhD. So it really, it varies from grant to grant. So there's no straightforward answer to that. Similarly, other questions included ethical considerations, or how many hypotheses should be there. It all depends on your own research proposal. And in order to find answers, you have to navigate through all the past webinars that we conducted, especially on research methodology. So those webinars answered these kind of questions. Right now, I'd like to close the webinar now. Sarah, thank you so much. This was very informative.
Thank you,
And
Mahvesh.
to
Thank you
see
so much.
everybody on the 2nd of July once again. Have a very good evening, everyone.